Today I'm going to talk about stated preference methods to measure a monetary value of environmental goods and services. And I'm going to talk about two basic methods, contingent valuation and choice modeling. And I'm going to explain what it is, and I'm going to show case studies. So this is where we are. 2 weeks ago I talked about why we want to value stuff and what do we actually mean by value. Last week I looked at revealed preference methods, and now we're going to look at the second set of methods. The stated preference methods essentially infer preferences by asking people about their intended behavior. And they come in two different flavors. One is the contingent valuation method, that is the oldest, where essentially you go around and you ask, what would you pay for this? And then the second set of methods that is something of more recent times is you essentially do the same as we do in marketing. You present people with a bundle of attributes, and then you ask them, you give them options to choose from, and they vary obviously because otherwise there's nothing to choose. And then you ask them, which of these 5 alternatives do you like best? And then you infer a demand function from that. So that's essentially what we do. And we're going to look at this in more detail. The good thing about stated preference methods is that you can ask about anything. So last week we talked about revealed preferences, and one of the drawbacks of travel costs or hedonic pricing or defensive expenditures is that essentially you can only estimate the direct use value. And perhaps sometimes other forms of use value, but essentially it's limited to the direct use value. And the week before that we said, well, but there's many other aspects of value as well. And the good thing about the stated preference methods is that you can ask about anything. You can ask about the existence value of the blue-cheeked monkey if you're so interested. You're independent of what is going on in the market. With hedonic pricing, you need to make assumptions about how the housing market works or how the labor market works. And if your assumptions are wrong in the sense that they don't correspond to how the labor market or the housing market really works, then your values are wrong as well, or the things that you estimated are wrong. With contingent valuation, contingent choice, you don't do this. You can generate your own data because essentially it's a survey method, so you can go out and ask whomever about whatever. Whereas with hedonic pricing or with travel costs, you rely on data providers. And of course the examples that you see in the literature and that you see discussed in textbooks are the examples where people got hold of those data. But there's many more examples where we know there is interesting data out there, but they won't give it to you, right? And another good thing about stated preference methods is that since you do not rely on things that happen, you can also ask about things that are still to happen, right? Stated preference method necessarily look at the past, because we only have observations of the past, but with revealed preference methods necessarily look at the past. Stated preference methods you can also use to look at the future. You can expand your survey to include other issues, to see whether certain types of people value things better or worse than others, by asking direct questions or by collecting lots of demographic data. So those are the main strengths. There's two key weaknesses. The one is just the practical matter. It is very difficult to do this right. So last week I gave you roughly a price for, say, a hedonic pricing method, which is a year of a PhD student, plus data collection, then you come to 50,000 pounds or so. Stated preference methods, to get those right, you need 3 times that. So if you want to estimate a single value, then you're easily down 150,000 pounds per number that you estimate, right? So that is a practical drawback. The conceptual drawback is that it's not rooted in actual behavior. You're asking people what they would do if, and that essentially you make 3 leaps of faith. So really what you're interested in is how people behave in an actual market, but what you're asking is how people say they would behave in a hypothetical market. So you're making the assumption that actual behavior is the same as intended behavior. You're making the assumption that intended behavior in the real market is the same as intended behavior in a hypothetical market. And you're making the assumption that people report truthfully, that what they say is what they intend to do. And it can go wrong on all 3 scores. And people may get this wrong for all sorts of reasons. So there's been sort of tests where they interviewed people in the parking lot of a supermarket and asked them, did you buy toilet paper? And many people would say yes to that question. And then you ask them, so what toilet paper did you buy and how much did you pay for it? And a lot of people just don't know. They just don't know what they just bought a few minutes ago. And then if you then ask them, so can I see the toilet paper that you bought, and can I look at the receipt that you got to actually check the answer that you gave me to what you have really done? And it turns out that people just blank, right? They bought this stuff, don't know whether they bought white or pink toilet paper, right? They just don't know whether it has multiple layers or single layers or what have you. And they haven't got a clue how much they just paid. So there's all sorts of things that can go wrong here, right? And this is a simple question. How much did you buy toilet paper, and how much did you pay for it, and what did you buy? Because it is so hard, it's a very active and very large part of the research effort in environmental economics, right? This is essentially what environmental economics is about to a lot of people. And here you see 2 of the big guys in this field, Richard Carson and Mike Hanneman. So, contingent valuation. What would you pay for this particular good or service? That's essentially what is going on. So what do you do in a contingent valuation study? You start by doing your background work, and then you sort of decide, because it's essentially a survey, you decide how are we going to survey people. Are we going to do it online? Are we going to do it on a mobile phone? Are we going to ask them in person? Are we going to call them up? You need to decide who you're going to survey, what is your target population, and what is your sampling strategy, right? So that you're reasonably certain that the people you observe are representative of the population you're interested in. Then you design the questions that you're going to ask. You need to pre-test that by first badgering your colleagues and then try it on real people out there, because of course your colleagues are not real. You need to redesign your survey as a result of that. Then you need to get people to actually administer the survey, definitely if you're doing it in person. You need to hire and train interviewers. You need to try it out, and then you discover that you've done it all wrong. You need to go back to the drawing board. And you actually do it, and then you need to enter your data and analyze the data, and so on and so forth, right? So there's quite a lot of things that are going on here if you want to do this. The critical issues are in the survey design, right? So that's what I'm going to talk about most. So you're asking a question about how much would you pay, say, to help protect the South Downs National Park, right? Suppose that is the question you're interested in. So the first thing you need to establish from the people you're interviewing is, are they actually familiar with this? Do they know what is the South Downs National Park? Do they go and hike there? Do they not know it exists? And depending on what they think it is, and what they use it for, you may get very different answers, and that may color what is going on. So a recent arrivee at our faculty, I had a conversation with her. She did not know that there are cliffs in Sussex, right? Having lived here for a year. That was quite astounding to me, right? Apparently has just gone up and down from Brighton to the university, and that's all she's ever done. But yeah, if you then ask such a person about Devil's Dyke and the natural beauty there, you would get essentially completely uninformed answers, right? So you first need to know, what are these people like, and what do they know about the subject? And if you ask them, do they think it's a wonderful thing, or do they think it's run down and dangerous, right? You need to know about their attitudes. Are they green or are they brown? Do they generally support the provision of public goods like a national park, or are they sort of libertarians who want to minimize government interference? That may color their results, and definitely something that you want to control for later on. And then you cannot, and we talked about this extensively, value is not really defined, right? Really the only thing we can reasonably deduce is changes in value. So you need to compare the status quo to a hypothetical situation. What if we build a highway over the South Downs? Or what if we start charging for parking? You need to have a change scenario, or you need to describe that very clearly. And for that, you also need to know what they know about the current situation, right? So if your intervention is, we're going to charge for parking on Ditchling Beacon, if somebody thinks mistakenly that you already have to pay for parking at Ditchling Beacon, they would give a different answer than if that is not the case, if they don't believe them, right? And even if they do believe that, and you then correct them and say, no, then of course you have immediately an interaction with the interviewee where you corrected their knowledge. And some people are grateful if you teach them, and some people get upset if you teach them, right? If you confront them with a fact. Then you need to elicit the values, right? You need not just describe what is going to change, but also how you're going to change things. Is it a parking fee? Is it an entrance fee? Parking fees, of course, applies to people who come by car, but not people who come by bike or by bus. But entrance fees apply to everybody, and people may respond differently to that. Then you need an elicitation mechanism. I'm going to talk about that, and follow-up questions, and so on and so forth, right? So you need to do lots of things, right? And all those things can go wrong. As I said, the most persistent criticism of contingent valuation is that there's no economic commitment. People do not necessarily put their money where their mouth is, right? One interesting experiment that was done was that there were interviewers in the parking lot of a castle. And they interviewed people who were coming in and asked them, how much would you pay to go visit this castle, right? And obviously the people, they were there, they could see the castle, there was nothing hypothetical about the castle, right? The big heap of stone, they could see it and so on and so forth. And they had an intention to visit. Otherwise, why would they have parked their car there, right? And asked them, so how much would you pay as an entrance fee? And people gave answers. Some people say £1, and other people say £5, and so on and so forth. And then you ask all the other questions, so where are you from, and how did you get here, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the interview, they offered people an entrance ticket at the price that they had just quoted. And about 40% of people said, oh, that's way too much. I'm not going to pay that, right? Turned around and walked away, right? So there is a real issue here with what do people say? Why do they give an answer like that? And they had no intention of paying it. It was completely sort of we're approached in a car park. There's no reason to give a wrong answer, right? Or to lie about your real intentions. But a lot of people did. Some just said, well, I'm not going to go in now because it's way bigger than I thought it was, and I will come back tomorrow when I have more time, right? That's a perfectly valid answer to refuse this. But other people said, no, this is worth £5 per person. And then when they're offered a ticket for £5, they refuse to buy it, right? So people can go completely wrong in this, right? So part of the problem is that you're asking people an unfamiliar question. It's not unfamiliar that you're being asked to pay for something. We all have lots of experience with that. But you're being asked to pay for something strange. And questions you may ask is, how much are you willing to pay to help preserve the blue-cheeked monkey? And that is not the question that you come across often, right? So you may never have heard of the blue-cheeked monkey. If I ask you how much are you willing to pay for a pint of milk, that is a question that I think you have solved a couple of times last week. And therefore you are reasonably familiar with what the price should be, but don't forget the example I just gave about the toilet paper. But if you're asked to contribute to something that is entirely unfamiliar to you, you simply have difficulty in answering this question reasonably, right? So one solution is for this is to give people time to think. The problem with giving people time to think and perhaps consulting people they are with at that particular moment is that you make the interview longer, therefore more expensive for the surveyor, but also more annoying for your interviewees, right? You could, instead of forcing people to answer on the spot, you could give them the survey and say, take it home and send it back to us, assuming that they then spend more time on it. But of course, you know how people work, right? You know how you prepare for your exams and your essays, right? You postpone until the very last minute, and even though you had 3 weeks to do it, you still do it in the final 30 minutes, right? So there's not necessarily easy now. And then it says cheap talk scripts. And this morning there was a whole slide on cheap talk scripts that has mysteriously disappeared. Anyway, so I'll put that back in. And you can read about it at home. There's a million other things that can go wrong. There may simply be protest bids. So you may ask, we're gonna start raising entrance fees on the South Island National Park to pay for its upkeep. And even though you quite value the national park, you may completely and utterly disagree with the fact that you should pay for that and the additional infrastructure that comes with paying for this. Or you may think we should pay this from general taxation. And therefore you're going to say, I am not prepared to pay. Even though you value the goods, if the way things are going to pay for it is offensive to you, or the fact that you're trying to value such a thing as a national park is offensive to you, then people may simply protest, right? These things are very real. There was a study about the value of the Baltic Sea, or how much people thought should be paid towards cleaning up the Baltic Sea, and they interviewed Lithuanians in Lithuania, and they were quite happy to pay, and they interviewed Poles in Poland, and they were quite happy to pay, and then they interviewed Lithuanians in Poland, and they were not prepared to pay. And the reason for that was that the suggestion was we're going to raise taxes to pay for the cleanup of the Baltic Sea, and Lithuanians in Poland don't trust the Polish government. Nothing to do with them being Lithuanian, because when they were in Lithuania they did trust their government, and the Poles in Poland do trust their government, but the Lithuanians in Poland do not. And that is what you may be picking up rather than the valuation. Hopefully I have time to talk about willingness to pay versus willingness to accept. There may be a strategic bias going on. So you're going around asking people, how much are you willing to pay for? And then some people realize that they're not actually being asked to pay, but really what is going on is that they're asking loads of people, they're going to take the average of these numbers, and then they're going to present it to the government. And if you happen to value this particular goods, if you happen to care a lot about the South Island National Park, you're going to give a high number, because if you think that the government should contribute a lot, then the best way of getting your average higher is to overstate your preferences, right? Or perhaps you think it's all a load of nonsense and you don't want your taxes to go up. When you give a lower number, people may realize what this number is being used for and try to influence it, right? In either way. There are things that can go wrong in the way people interpret things, right? I talked about the blue-cheeked monkey. You may never have heard of the blue-cheeked monkey. So therefore you say, go away, I'm not interested in this animal. Alternatively, you may start the interview with telling a story about the blue-cheeked monkey and how it's a poor animal that is being threatened to the point of extinction by evil loggers and so on and so forth. You provide a lot of information and you create sympathy for the animal, and then all of a sudden, because of what the story that you just told, people's values go up, or at least their stated values go up, right? So that is a problem, right? Because if you don't tell people anything, you leave them in the dark as to what you're really trying to do, and it's also very hard to interpret their results. But you can also give too much information and then you're leading them to a particular answer. So that is a very, very difficult thing to get right. You, instead of asking an open question, how much are you prepared to pay, you can also ask the question, are you prepared to pay more than £5 a month? But then of course that £5 that you give initially becomes an anchor, that the interviewee thinks that £5 is a reasonable number, right? And you steer them in that way. There are biases that have to do with the interviewer. There are just people who just always say yes, right? So if you present them with a question, they always say yes. Whatever you suggest to them. There's also people who always say no. So that is an issue, but you can also have real problems with the interviewer. And they can be really biased. So an old friend of mine partly paid away through college by being an interviewer. And one of the things that she did was help understand the numeracy of ethnic minorities. So this was in the Netherlands, so she went into the homes of Turks and Moroccans and asked them simple questions, how much is 7 times 7? In order to measure, can they do this, right? What is their level of education? And she's a very nice girl, right? So she felt sorry for them and started helping them. And then of course you have a problem, right? You have a big problem. She's a lovely girl, but perhaps not the one you want as your interviewer, right? And there's more extreme examples of that. Was a recent, or not so recent, field study where they tried to measure the incidence of HIV in Kenya. And the only way to really do that is take people's blood. So that was part of the interview protocol. And a lot of things went right. And they found sort of reasonable numbers and interesting numbers out of that. And then they looked closely at the data, and there was this one interviewer that was completely off, right? No HIV whatsoever. And it turned out, when they started pressing the guy, what had really happened is that he'd taken blood from a cow, because he did not want to ask people for their blood, which I would hesitate to do. He thought, well, I'm just going to take blood from a cow and that's it, right? And then there was this other interviewer where there was 100% HIV, and he similarly was afraid to ask people for that blood, and he took his own blood, not as clever as the first guy. And it turned out that he was HIV positive. And he described it to everybody in his sample. So things really can go wrong there, right? Because your interviewer may just not be reliable. But it may also be that your interviewer creates a bias, right? So if you're interviewing people on the streets, how much are you willing to pay for the South Downs National Park? Somebody walks up to you in the streets with bad breath, your response may be go away, right? And that has nothing to do with your evaluation. Or it may be that a pretty girl walks up to you and asks you how much are you willing to pay to the preservation of the South Downs National Park. And you may think, oh, she's interested in this, I better give a high number to impress her, right? Those things happen, right? So you need to be very careful there. I once did with a group of students, not unsimilar to yours, a study like this, and it was a semester-long thing where we designed the survey, we implemented the survey, and then we tested the results, and it turned out that in the end the only thing that was significant was the interviewer number, right? The only thing that could explain our result was who did the interview, and all the rest was insignificant. And then there are issues with what do people actually do when they answer these questions. And 2 weeks ago I talked very briefly about the Exxon Valdez disaster, where, as I said, Exxon, now ExxonMobil, hired these big shots from MIT to do this study, and they completely thrashed contingent valuation methods. And the key part on their evidence was that they had done this survey in Louisiana, where the question was, Louisiana had a lot of oil drilling at that time, and as a result there were sort of these pools of oil just in the landscape, and birds could not really see the distinction between a pool of water and a pool of oil, and all sorts of ducks landed in those pools of oil and drowned and what have you. And the survey that they did was, we're going to put nets over these pools so that the ducks don't drown, right? They are simply prevented from going in there. And how much would you be willing to pay for this particular measure? And they split their sample into 3. And the first third of the sample, they asked, this measure is going to save 2,000 ducks. And the second third, they said this measure is going to save 20,000 ducks for the same cost, not per duck, but in total. And then the third sample, 200,000 ducks were saved. And then they found that the answer was the same. People were prepared to pay $50 for this, regardless of whether that $50 would save 2,000 ducks or 20,000 ducks or 200,000 ducks. This is the so-called scope insensitivity, or the part-hole bias, or the embedding, and it goes by different names. And the question is, what is going on here? And their conclusion was, of course, that this is all nonsense, right? It cannot be that 1/3 of the population is prepared to pay 100 times more per duck than another randomly selected third of the population. These studies don't mean anything, right? That was, of course, their conclusion. But there's other interpretations, and they're given here, and that is that people may actually not really be answering the question, but they may see this as more misery in the world, and it is my duty to help solve this misery, so I'm going to give $50 or £50 to solving this, and then I can feel good about myself again. That really what people are giving is not so much contributing, not so much to the specific environmental good or service that you're trying to value, but they just want to do good and as a result feel good about themselves. The so-called warm glow explanation. And essentially the model that people then have in their mind is, this year I'm going to contribute £500 to charity, and I'm going to give £50 to the first 10 charities that knock on my door, and then it's all well and good, and it's over, right? And that is the model that people have in their minds, and they just don't want to think about these things. And then you get this very non-specific £50 for whatever question you're asking. So that is one explanation. A more recent explanation goes back to the work around not just noticeable differences. And that is that the way people count ducks is really 1, 2, 3, 6, many. And you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between a flock of 2,000 ducks and 20,000 ducks, right? If there's somewhere in the distance you see there's a lot of ducks, but actually, unless you're specifically trained in counting animals, you have a hard time estimating their true quantity. And if that is how people count, 1, 2, 3, 6, many, but there's nothing in between, then yes, they would give the same answer to 20 and 200,000 ducks, because both fall under many. And there is no difference in people's minds between numbers of ducks, as long as the numbers are large. So all sorts of things can go wrong here, right? Which of course makes it a very interesting academic exercise, right? This is something that academics get all excited about, trying to find methods and ways around this, and then catching their colleagues and competitors out for making silly mistakes. That's what we academics love to do, but of course for the applications that I talked about 2 weeks ago, if you want to use this in court, if you want to use this in a cost-benefit analysis to advise the government, you have a real problem on your hands, right? You just need to be very, very careful. So let's look at Stonehenge for a bit. That is Stonehenge. I don't need to tell you that. So this is what Stonehenge currently looks like. So there you have Stonehenge, and then there's a big parking lot, and there's 2 roads, the A303 and the A344, that are there. If you ever been to Glastonbury, then you know these roads, right? Absolutely horrendous roads they are. And the proposal was to bury the whole thing underground, to make an underground parking lot, take away the A303 altogether, and put the A344 underground as well. And the question is, how much are people prepared to pay for this? The construction of the whole thing at the time was estimated to be 175 million pounds. The bad thing is that if you're driving in your car or you're standing in a traffic jam, you can no longer see Stonehenge. Benefits is that traffic would speed up. Would be fewer accidents for people paying attention to the monument rather than the road. The visitors to Stonehenge would no longer be bothered by the noise and by the visual disamenity of the traffic, right? So how do you do that? Well, essentially what they did here was they showed the pictures I just showed, and this is what it looks like now, and this is what it will look like in the future, and gave all that information, right? So, and the wording here is very neutral. It's not that the scenario says, oh, this is a great thing. It really sort of goes, yeah, a factual comparison of the things. And then the question was, which option is preferred? And the format that was used is a so-called payment ladder. So far I've been sort of saying, well, we're just asking people how much are you willing to pay for this, and it turns out that then you get fairly nonsensical answers. So one alternative to that is to use the so-called payment ladder, where you give these options from 0 to £200 per household per year, I think is the number. And then you give them all those options and you essentially ask them, yes, I'm prepared to pay this, but not that, right? The great disadvantage of this is that you ask people to put lots of ticks and crosses. But you can minimize that by saying, okay, this is my maximum cross, my minimum cross and my maximum tick, right? Now, what did people find? 55% prefer the status quo, And we're actually prepared to pay £2.70 per year for that. 45% preferred the new situation, the tunnel, and we're prepared to pay almost £9 per household per year for it, right? And the main reason that they said, well, if we bury all this stuff, then Stonehenge will be better preserved. Whereas the other people who said, no, keep it as it is, they actually liked seeing this from the road. Then add it all up, scale it up to the UK population. Then, for the tunnel, because the willingness to pay was so much higher, the proportion of people was somewhat lower, it generated a positive impact of £114 million, right? And we called it the cost was 125. So this may not be the preferred way to go. Right, so that is what people do. Now the alternative, as I said, to continued valuation within the stated methods, stated preference methods, is so-called conjoint analysis or choice modeling or choice experiments. They're all the same thing. And essentially what you do is what people do all the time. So if you have to choose a bank, or in this case you have to choose a credit card, and this is a strange example. Citibank and Bank of America operate in the US, but Lloyds Bank does not operate in the US. So I don't know who made up this example, but it is peculiar. But this is what you get if you're choosing a credit card. How much do you pay per year? Or if you choose, you choose a credit card. What sort of car do you get? Is it gold, or is it platinum, or is it just black, or grey in case of Bank of America, I think? Does it include car insurance? Does it have a credit limit, and how high is that credit limit, and how much do you pay on these things? This is how you are presented if you go to one of those comparison websites and you're choosing a credit card. This is what you're presented with. Or if you go to Amazon and you're picking a particular product, and at the very bottom there is this comparison, and you have this table of prices and characteristics and so on and so forth. This is what you're used to doing. If you go into the supermarket to get cornflakes, you walk to the aisle with the cornflakes, and you have all these different boxes, different prices, different sizes, different weights, and that's how you make your choice, right? You don't go around wondering how much would I pay for a box of cornflakes. No, you go into the supermarket and you pick from your choices, or you go into Amazon or something like this. So this then directly translates, in this case, to a study of willingness to pay for renewable energy, where you can also choose, I don't like renewable energy, right? That's one option you can tick. Or you can say, we're going to put the turbines on shore. That is relatively cheap, but it has negative impacts on birds and bats, and you may actually not like the visual intrusion that comes with that. You can put the windmills out in sea. That's more expensive, or you may also not like what those things do to seabirds. Or we're going to put in wave power, right? That's the first scenario that you see on that, where you have less visual intrusion, but it's more expensive still. These prices are nonsense. Wave power is much more expensive than offshore wind. So that is what you ask people to choose from. Of course, this doesn't tell you a whole lot. So you're going to do two things. You're going to present the same person with different combinations of this. That's one thing you do, but there's 4 different attributes here, right? Distance from shore, the price, the wildlife impact, and the location. So you actually, all of these have different levels. You can't be asking people 100 questions, right? So you're going to ask everybody in your sample 4 or 5 of these, and then different parts of your sample you're going to ask different combinations, right? So that's what you really do, and that's where your statistical power comes from. So this is what the interviewee sees. And really what is going on is you have different options, different alternatives, in this case in different rows. Of course, it doesn't have to be like that. You have your different attributes. What are we trying to value? Distance from shore, the price, location, impact on wildlife. And then all of those attributes have different levels, right? Maybe very negative, negative, neutral, positive, very positive in the case of wildlife. So that is what the interviewer thinks, or the survey designer thinks. The good thing about choice modeling is you sort of get multi-dimensional change, so it's more realistic, and you can tease things apart much more realistically, whereas in a contingent valuation you essentially present the packets and the whole packets, right? Whereas here you can actually unpack the different attributes. It is much more familiar, as I said. This is how we make choices all the time, and therefore because you're not you're not forcing people to make a choice. How much are you willing to pay for? You have less protest votes, less naysaying. You also have less yay saying, because you're not asking people to say yes or no, or £10 or nothing. You're just asking them to make a choice, right? The drawback of this format is that the cost aspect may actually be sort of snowed under all these things. And if you ask people to look at this, there's been many of these studies, and people tend to just zoom in into one particular aspect. And they may just either have attention deficit because they're tired, or they're bored, or they couldn't be bothered, right? Or they may just be limited in their cognition, right? And they may just completely, if you read this design, you may actually just completely ignore the wildlife impact, right? Because the location and the distance from shore have pictures, and people tend to zoom in on pictures, and I actually had to read this a couple of times to notice that there's a 4th attribute, namely the impact on wildlife. That's completely sort of almost disappears in the design, so I wouldn't blame people if they ignore this, right? But it may also be that they ignore the price. And that really the decisions that you elicit are all about how pretty they think the pictures are, or where they happen to live in Scotland, and that they completely ignore the price. And then of course you're not eliciting how much they're willing to pay, but then you're eliciting which pictures do they think are the prettiest, and do they suffer from NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard type of attitudes. The good thing about having sort of the price aspect hidden, or somewhat hidden, is that you don't have that many protests against, I don't want to pay for this, right? Or this should be free, this is priceless. I mentioned those things, right? That people may just focus on one thing only. That thing that this is the data are more difficult to analyze for the researchers is not a drawback, right? You can see that as a drawback if you're forced to do that in class, but of course this is a way of showing our competence in econometrics, which is what academics like to do. They like to brag about how good they are technically. So the setup is very much the same as for contingent valuation, right? You need to go through all the design steps and so on and so forth. The analysis is the random utility model, which is exactly the same as for the travel cost or organic pricing, and we talked a little bit about that last week. Now, one important thing that I talked about 2 weeks ago, but it is particularly important for contingent valuation studies and contingent choice studies, is what are you actually trying to measure? And 2 weeks ago I introduced willingness to pay, or the Hicksian equivalent variation, and I said that is really you're going to the supermarket and buying a pint of milk and giving up a bit of your income to obtain that. And then the minimum willingness to accept compensation is the Hicksian compensating variation, and that is the scenario where you go to the supermarket, you bought your pint of milk, you paid for it, and then somebody knocks it out of your hand, right, and offers compensation for the loss of your milk. It is, and the way this works in a demand curve, the willingness to pay, you're paying for an improvement, right? So your initial situation is E0, your initial income is Y0, and then in the end you have more of the stuff but less of your income, right? And your total willingness to pay is the difference in your income. That's the amount of money you want to give up. Whereas willingness to accept compensation, you start with an initial situation E1 and initial income Y0, then you're losing some of the things that you care about, but you're gaining income, right? So your income goes from Y0 to Y1, and it's very rarely the case that it jumps so far, but that makes the picture nice and readable, right? But actually there's 4 welfare measures, right? There's the maximum willingness to pay for an improvement, and they come just all together. There's the minimum willingness to pay, minimum willingness to accept compensation for a deterioration, but there's of course also the maximum willingness to pay to prevent a deterioration. And there's the minimum willingness to accept compensation for foregoing an improvement. And it's important to keep these things separate, right? And to realize, yes, these are different things. And you may be counting on things getting better, and then somebody comes along and says, no, that's not true. And one example is what we talked about in the seminar, that you may have thought that evening teaching is a feature of this term only, and then I came along and said, no, this is a permanent feature. And it's not so permanent for you as it is for us, right? And that may upset you, right? Because you had hoped that we would go back to normal working hours after Christmas, and now we've learned that is probably not the case. And that is foregoing an improvement, right? You thought the situation was going to get better, but it's not. And here we see these things graphically, right? Thought you would move from here to here, but you're not, and so on and so forth. Now, there's been a lot of attention to willingness to pay versus willingness to accept compensation. And if you just look at this particular graph, we move between two situations. On the environmental axis, we move between two different income scenarios. You may think it should not differ very much, right? And the scenario that I just sketched, that you go into the supermarket, you buy a pint of milk, and you pay £1.50 for that. Well, it's a pint of milk, that's a bit expensive, right? Let's say you paid £1 for that. And then you walk out of the supermarket and I come along and I knock it out of your hand. And the milk is all spilled. How much would you ask for compensation? £1, right? Because that is what you just paid for it. And you may sort of say, oh, you also need to compensate me a little bit for my time and then for the intrusion, so let's make it £2, right? But if you were going back into the supermarket anyway because you forgot to buy something else, then you might as well just say, give me £1, right? And made whole again. That may be your intuition here. And if you're a diehard neoclassical microeconomist, then that is the answer you would give, right? There is no real reason why your willingness to pay and your willingness to accept compensation would differ for a good such as milk that is easily replaceable, not unique or anything like that. Right? Now that is not entirely true, because in a willingness to pay scenario you're giving up income and therefore you face an opportunity cost of the income you've just given up. If you spend that pound on milk, you cannot spend it on chocolate, right? Whereas, and there you have a budget constraint. Whereas if you're asking for compensation, you're not bound by the budget, right? You may be bound by somebody else's budget, but not by your own, right? And you may not care about somebody else's budget. So there is a different income effect, right? Willingness to pay, you get poorer. Willingness to accept compensation, you get richer. But if we are talking about a pint of milk and £1, then that income effect should be negligible, right? And that is indeed what Robert Wheeler showed in a paper in the American Economic Review in 1976. It showed that willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation are essentially the same numerically, because the income effect is very small. So people try this out in the lab, and that is the red results that you see. And they asked people to value something, buying it, and then they took it away from them and they asked, how much do we give, how much money do we need to give you in return? And then they took the ratio of the willingness to pay and the willingness to accept compensation, and the theory predicts they should be roughly equal to 1. And 1 is what we see here, and what we found is that in about 4% of cases it is 1 or slightly smaller than 1. Then in about 35% of cases it's somewhere between 1 and 2. Between 2 and 3, this is the ratio of willingness to accept compensation over willingness to pay, and actually in 10% of the cases the willingness to accept compensation was 10 times as large, or more than 10 times as large as the willingness to pay for the same good or service. And this was not to do with something unique being destroyed. If I ask you about the night watch of Rembrandt, and what would you be paying to avoid destroying that versus what would you pay for Rembrandt to come back and paint another night watch? There it sort of makes sense that there's a big difference, right? Because there's only one of those things, so If you're willing to pay to get another one, you actually destroy the value and the uniqueness of it, whereas it would be sort of an immeasurable loss if it does get destroyed, right? So there it makes sense that there is a big difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. No, these experiments are about such things as Mars bars and coffee cups. And in one of the scenarios, they had these students come into the room, they gave them all a coffee mug, and it was actually in the same building as where they sell these things. And then they took it away, and how much compensation did you need? And people said, give me $10 because you just took away the coffee mug that you gave me. And I know that downstairs I can buy them for $5, but I want $10 in return for you taking away this thing. And some of these differences can be explained by loss aversion and by a status quo bias, right? So one's willingness to pay scenario is somebody comes knocking on your door and says, you know that park down the road? No, you know that parking lot down the road? The city gave us permission to turn that into a park, and we're going to have trees, and we're going to have grass, and we're going to have a nice fountain. But we got permission to do so, but we haven't got funding to do so. How much are you willing to pay? How much are you willing to contribute to turn this parking lot into a park? That is one scenario. That's the willingness to pay scenario. The opposite scenario is that somebody comes knocking on your door and they say, you know that park down the road. They're going to turn it into a parking lot, and we realize that this causes a loss to you, and in order to prevent you appealing planning permission, we're willing to give you some money to shut up. We're actually willing to bribe you. How much should we give you, right? That is a willingness to accept compensation scenario. And objectively the two are the same, right? It's concrete and steel versus grass and trees and a fountain. And the difference is the difference between the concrete and the steel and the grass and the trees, right? But it may be that that park is where you walked your dog every morning and evening. It may be that that park is where you kissed that girl, right? So you may have memories to that, and if they're going to turn into a parking lot, those memories will disappear. So part of this may be driven by emotional attachment to whatever they're taking away from you, right? And then it makes sense that there's a discrepancy between willingness to pay and willingness to accept compensation. The experiments that they've done is you walk into the room to an experiment, you get a coffee mug, and then 5 minutes later they take away the coffee mug from you. And I think there's something wrong with you if you create an emotional attachment to a coffee mug, but if you sort of create an emotional attachment to something that has been in your possession for only 5 minutes, then there's something seriously wrong with you, right? That cannot explain the majority of the responses. And it may just be pure an endowment effect. It may be it's a power thing, because the experiments on which this is done is typically students, and the one who's doing the experiments is the professor, right? So it may just be that this is a way of getting back at him, right? Or protesting the hierarchy in the university or something like that. Or it may be this is a way of making some money because I know he's much richer than I am, right? Maybe things like that. And it may have to do with the fact that it's voluntary versus involuntary. So if you go to the pub tonight and you get horribly drunk, and then you decide to steal a car, you get into an accident, you hit a tree and you lose a leg, that's pretty bad, right? You would feel very bad if your leg is gone. Now, if I go to the pub tonight and I get horribly drunk and I get into my car, I don't need to steal one, and get you into an accident and you lose your leg, that's worse, right? Somehow that is worse, although objectively it's the same. You have one leg only instead of two at the start of the day. But the fact that somebody else does it to you rather than something that you have done to yourself makes it different, and you would attach a different value to that. And then you would probably also attach a different value if it is a true accident, right? It's an innocent little lady who lost control over the wheel and you got into an accident, versus somebody like me who got drunk and my negligence gets you into an accident. You value those things differently. And that also explains why willingness to pay versus willingness to accept compensation give different answers, right? You sort of like, you set up this experiment, you set up this survey, and you as an experimenter or as a surveyor think that you nailed it down, right? That this is the question we are asking about. But then you're interviewing people, right? And people always interpret the situation. People never listen to what you said and just what you said, right? That's not what people do. They listen to what you say, they hear most things, they mishear some things, they don't hear some things at all, and then they put an interpretation on whatever you just told them. And really what they're answering is not the thing that you very carefully wrote down in your question, but they're answering the scenario that they made of it, right? And that explains some of the things. I won't give you the Thaler examples. What?
Yeah, so basically they're all up there, except some of the slides have a cross. So when you go into slide panel, it disappears, but they're on
there. Thank you. I did not even know that was possible. So that explains the slide that disappeared. Some of the slides that disappeared. And the whole study about carbon offsets disappeared. Do you also know how I can make them reappear again? So these are slides that are inherited from George, and George is a great guy. He teaches things differently than I do. He also is a Mac man, right? Whereas I am IBM. And he knows how to make slides disappear, and I never knew that was possible. I am just flabbergasted, right? I was flabbergasted that we were reached willingness to pay versus willingness to accept compensation so quickly, and I completely skipped the results. The case study that he put in. So very briefly, George was reading from his own work there, and one of the things that they did and used the conjoint choice experiment was estimate the value of carbon offsets. And it's a published paper. George was reading from his own work, and essentially they did the sort of things that I described, right? They asked people to choose, would you want a carbon offset, yes or no, if you're booking a flight, right? And that's an option if you've flown with EasyJet or British Airways or something, you've seen this. And then they give different attributes to those carbon offsets that are certified, and of course different prices. What is this carbon offset doing except for offsetting carbon? Does it help the poor natives? Does it preserve biodiversity? You can do all that, and then you can sort of estimate essentially the same as in anodic pricing. You have the price and then all its attributes, and you just run a regression of one on the other. And what you find is that yes, people are willing to pay extra if it preserves biodiversity, and they actually care more about animals, 3.7, than they care about humans. Or maybe, that's one interpretation, or maybe they trust that the money would go usefully to the animals, but not usefully to the humans. There's a price elasticity, right? The higher the price, the less people are prepared to pay, minus 2.5. You can do all those things, and then one of the interesting things, and that is why I put this up, try to put it up, is the comments that you get, right? The information that you get from the freewheeling that you get at the end. The positive ones are, it's an emergency, right? It's about climate change. We must act. Strange remark, right? Because really, does this solve much of the problem? No. The second comment that you see there is a bit more sensible. If I don't do my bit, I can't blame others for not doing theirs when the ice cap melts. That makes sense. And then the third remark is we must fight for the penguins, right? All of a sudden penguins are threatened by climate change rather than polar bears. People have sort of like these strange things in their mind, right? What they're really trying to save. Penguins are not particularly threatened by climate change. And then there's the negative comments as well. This sounds like a scam. It could actually be true. It's not so much British Airways that got into trouble here, but it was KLM, Air France, that got into trouble. They sold carbon offsets, and they bought land in Uganda and planted trees on those lands, and that was a carbon offset, right? So if you fly, you burn kerosene, and if you burn kerosene, you get CO2 into the atmosphere. If you grow trees, they suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, and if you plant enough trees per flight, you exactly offset what is going on. So Air France KLM did that and sold lots and lots of these offsets and bought lots and lots of land in Uganda and planted loads of trees. The problem in Uganda is that property rights are not particularly well defined or well enforced. So after 5 years of what they thought was buying land, and what they surely did was planting trees, the natives moved in and said, no, this is our land, you never properly bought it, and they cut down all the trees and put their cattle on the land, right? So it's, some of this is not quite as good as it sounds. And another comment that they got is, it's bourgeois, right? It must have been Jeremy Corbyn who said this, and distracting from the real issues to do this. Bourgeois is sort of like a token language that you would use if you're sort of a diehard Leninist Marxist, right? And then the third person here just interpreted it all wrong, right? So Walmart for a while had this ad out that you were giving discounts if you bought certain things, and their slogan was, if you buy more, you save more, right? Which is true. You save more on your shopping if you buy more in absolute sense, but of course you're paying more as well. And here the idea of the responder in the responder's head is that yes, these offsets are good, and in order to get these offset you need to fly more, right? Which is doing bad, and they completely misinterpreted it as and found it disgusting that this was even offered, that this was a way of convincing people to fly more, because you're just driving up the cost of flying, right? So people would fly less. So that was the, I think, the more insightful part of this particular part of the lectures that I skipped. Now I'm running out of steam. You look like you have had enough as well. At the very end, there is a lot of the repetition of the things that I've said already. So I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to see you guys next week. Next week we're going to completely change gear. And we're going to talk about policy instruments, taxes and subsidies and what have you. Okay, I'll see you guys then.